I've always enjoyed working the night shift. The silent stillness of the office, the soft glow of the computer screen, the absence of unnecessary chatter. This was all I needed to focus on my work. Working at night was more than just a way to earn money for me. It was my own little world where I could concentrate on the smallest details without distractions from conversations, laughter, or intrusive questions. But recently, something had changed. I couldn't quite put my finger on it, but I felt the atmosphere in the office shift. It was as if the building itself had grown heavier, its old walls no longer just holding in warmth, but also an inexplicable tension. Even though I wasn't particularly emotional, something inside me began to feel uneasy. If I'd had more time to think, I might have realized that something was off, but at that moment, I simply tried to focus on my work and ignore the small details. That night, as always, I sat at my computer, analyzing data for a project. Everything was going as usual. My finger pressed the keys, and my mind drifted between graphs and numbers. But something wasn't right. Every time the clock hit 2 a.m., I felt a strange chill fill the room. It wasn't a regular cold. It seeped through my bones. The air grew thick, and even the smallest sounds, like the rustle of my clothes or the click of the keyboard, felt unnervingly odd. I tried to brush it off as fatigue, bad weather, lower temperatures, but the sensation didn't fade. One time, when I'd nearly gotten used to the strange silence, I heard a ring. It wasn't an ordinary ring. It didn't come from the phone on my desk, but from somewhere else, almost like it was coming from the very environment itself. The echo was sharp and bright, far too loud for that hour. At first, I thought it was just an old phone, or maybe a colleague had forgotten to turn off their device. But when I picked up the receiver, I heard only silence. A void that stretched on endlessly. I waited for a moment, expecting someone to pick up the other line, but instead, I was met with a faint whisper I couldn't make out. Of course, it scared me. I hung up and decided I must just be overworked. But something inside me whispered that it wasn't just a coincidence. A few minutes passed. I returned to my work, trying to focus on the screen. But when the clock struck 2 o'clock again, the ring returned. This time, it was more persistent, almost frightening, as if someone was calling me to attention. I picked up the receiver again, and this time, there was something more than just silence. I could hear a low, almost wet voice speaking slowly, with a certain deliberate calmness. The third call will be decisive. The words were so clear that I couldn't understand how to process them. My eyes couldn't believe what they were hearing, and my mind couldn't make sense of it. It felt like that call would change everything. I put the receiver down, trying to calm myself, but the unease inside me lingered, a strange sensation that didn't fade for a long while. I asked myself, what could that have been? A technical glitch? Or maybe someone decided to prank me? But the voice was too real to be a coincidence. I tried to return to my work, but the feeling of being watched didn't leave me for a second. The next hour passed without incident, but in the middle of the night, the call came again. I couldn't understand why it kept happening at this hour, why in this particular order. I picked up the receiver, and this time I heard what sounded like a cold, piercing laugh coming through the phone. The third call, you won't forget it. The anxiety grew stronger. I felt my heart race, and my hands grew clammy with sweat. I dropped the receiver and sat back in my chair, not knowing what to do. What was this? It didn't feel like I was safe in that building anymore, and I couldn't keep working because every sound seemed too loud, every shadow looked too strange. And then I realized I couldn't stay there anymore. I grabbed my things and headed for the exit. Just as I reached the office door, I heard it again, the ring. But this time, it was so powerful that I felt my heart skip a beat. I stopped, turned around, and walked back to the phone. I picked up the receiver one last time and heard only 2 words. Run. Those 2 words shattered everything I thought I understood about what was happening. I hung up again and rushed out of the office, as if my mind had abandoned logic and left me alone with a feeling of dread. The next morning, when I returned, I learned that there had been a fire in the building, and that at the very moment I was receiving those calls, the flames had damaged the phone lines. All the phones were destroyed, except for one, the very one through which I had heard the calls. I even asked the security guard why he hadn't heard anything, but he said that neither he nor any other workers had any problems with the phones that night. And although we all survived the incident, I couldn't understand what had happened. Why had the calls sounded the way they did? Why that night? And why had I felt like someone was watching me, even after I'd left the building? The third call never came, but I realized one thing. Not everything around you needs to have an answer. In my town, there's an old shop that has always attracted attention with its unusual atmosphere. It looked as though time had forgotten it. The sign was nearly worn off, and the dirty windows made it impossible to see what was happening inside. But there was one thing that caught my eye, the light that always flickered at night. I always wondered who could be inside and why the shop never closed. Like most people, I'd always been curious, but at the same time, I felt uneasy whenever I walked past. There were rumors about it. Some said it was just an ordinary shop, while others whispered about strange things happening inside and warned not to go near it. One evening, as I was heading home from work, I noticed the shop's windows glowing again. As I walked past, I heard strange sounds, a creaking noise like old wood, or the rustling of something that shouldn't be heard in such a place. Something inside me urged me to turn around and go inside. I don't know why, but it felt like I had to. The door was heavy and noisy when I opened it, but it didn't creak the way I expected. Inside, the atmosphere was striking. Old shelves filled with dusty objects, boxes piled high with things I couldn't quite identify. It felt as though time had stopped in here years ago. The air was thick, heavy with the smell of dust and old wood. Everything seemed to have a story, and it felt like each item was waiting to be touched. I carefully examined the things on the shelves. Old books, magazines, bottles with strange substances inside. Everything looked as though it hadn't changed in decades. But what caught my attention the most was an old box on the top shelf. It was newer than the rest of the things around it. Brightly colored labels that clearly weren't from this time. I opened it and found several photographs, all showing the same building, but with different people in the foreground. I couldn't understand why this intrigued me so much. One of the photographs looked familiar, but I couldn't place why. It showed a young couple in the shop's interior, but nothing indicated it was taken many years ago. I looked closer at the pictures and noticed the same man in all of them, the elderly shopkeeper, but much younger. What startled me the most was one photograph. I was in it. Though I couldn't remember when or why I had been there, it was unmistakably me. My heart started racing when I realized that on the back of one of the photos, my name was written. I couldn't recall when I had been there or how that photo came to be. The feeling of unease deepened as I stared at the image, trying to make sense of it all. There was no explanation, and nothing felt right anymore. Suddenly, I felt an overwhelming pressure to leave. I turned to leave the store, but when I tried to open the door, it wouldn't budge. At first, I didn't understand what was happening. I pushed again, more forcefully, but the door remained firmly closed. Then I heard something, faint footsteps, slowly approaching from somewhere in the back. I turned around, but saw only the darkened room, the objects on the shelves now looking different, more alive. Everything around me started to shift, becoming less familiar, more threatening. I pressed frantically on the door, but it wouldn't open. My pulse quickened as the sense of being watched intensified. After what felt like an eternity, the door finally opened on its own. I didn't hesitate. I bolted out onto the street, looking back nervously. Since that night, I haven't gone near that shop again. The street it stood on has felt different ever since. I find it hard to remember exactly what happened inside, but I know something changed that night. Even now, whenever I walk past the building, it feels like someone or something is watching me from the inside. I've always considered myself a rational person, someone who believes in science rather than mysticism or the supernatural. My daily routine consisted of work, studying, and a few evenings spent chatting with friends over coffee. The paranormal and strange occurrences were nothing more than empty tales to me, until one night when everything I thought I knew about reality was shattered. It all started with a simple, accidental stumble upon a blog. Never trust those magical links to others' posts in social media. I found this blog on my own. It didn't have many followers. It had only been around for a few years, and the posts looked like casual, almost forgotten personal notes. The author, a man named Tim, began the blog with ordinary life updates. Work, home, walks with his dog. But as time passed, his entries started to take a strange turn. The first unusual post that caught my attention was about his unsettling feeling of being watched in his own home. Tim wrote about one morning when he woke up and felt an overwhelming sense of someone being present in his apartment. He described the feeling as if every movement and every breath were being listened to from another room, and the atmosphere in his apartment felt heavy, unnatural. Tim even mentioned hearing footsteps in the hallway when there was no one there. The first few months, he tried to explain away with stress and fatigue, but when he started finding misplaced objects or moved furniture, he couldn't ignore the feeling any longer. Tim decided to install security cameras around his apartment, thinking it would help him track what was happening. However, that only led to even stranger occurrences. On the footage, he began noticing dark figures appearing behind him or standing in doorways. These moments looked like they weren't part of reality, but more like shadows that couldn't be captured or explained. What was even stranger was that the cameras recorded these figures even when Tim was alone in the rooms, and he was sure there was no one else there. But what truly shook me and made me realize that this story was far more than just an oddity was when Tim noticed something on the cameras. He saw one of these dark figures lingering longer than the others. It didn't disappear even when Tim left the room. Over time, this figure became clearer. He started seeing it more distinctly, even when reviewing old footage, and noticed that it seemed to be staring at him, watching his every move. From that moment on, every new post on his blog became increasingly disturbing, describing not just physical anomalies, but psychological ones as well. In the following posts, Tim wrote about his strange dreams. One night, he began seeing the same person in his sleep, a man with blurred features who seemed to sit beside him in his apartment in the shadows. The more he tried to figure out who this person was, the more he felt as though he wasn't just seeing this man, but becoming a part of him, a reflection of him. Tim began noticing that his interactions in dreams affected reality. Objects started changing places, and he could hear whispers in the hallway, even when no one was there. Over the next few months, things got even worse. New posts began to emerge, including one about the night when Tim returned home to find his door wide open and an unfamiliar notebook lying on his table. He had never seen it before. Inside the notebook, there was only one line written in neat handwriting. "They're watching you. Tonight, they will begin to act." Tim was shaken and didn't know what to do. He decided to leave town for a few days to clear his mind. But when he returned, nothing had changed in his apartment. However, there was a new letter on his table, and this time it wasn't just a letter. It was a package containing several photographs, each showing a dark figure standing behind him, as if it were watching him. The post continued to grow more intense. Tim's last post was cryptic. He wrote about hearing not just footsteps, but voices calling his name when he was alone in his apartment. In the comments of his posts, anonymous users began to claim they had heard the same voice. It was then that Tim decided to act. He filmed a video for his blog, where he announced that everyone who was watching him would witness what he himself would see. That was the last video I saw on his blog. A few days later, I decided to check back on the blog to learn more. I went to the site, but it was gone. All of the posts had been erased, and the site no longer existed. The only thing left was one short post, dated only a few hours ago. I read it, and my hair stood on end. "You're next." I started to feel that they were watching me too. Shadows that I couldn't see hide in every reflection. And now I feel their eyes, even when I look into the mirror. I try to find any trace, any confirmation, but more and more I am convinced that I've become part of this game.